This is a book review of The 10-Cent Plague, the great comic book scare and how it changed America. Well, I think how it changed America is probably a bit overkill, but however, obviously changed for American comic books, and also, of course, changed for UK ones as well, because, of course, distribution of these American comics was pretty hard to find as well, 1950s, etc. So this book is by David Hajdu. It's about 430 pages, and it's from Picador. And I found it a thoroughly enjoyable read, very interesting. All the ins and outs about the politics, as well as committees that decided to go against comics. Comics are causing these problems. Delinquents are all causing, there's mass murder because of comics, and so on and so on. Look at the stuff. Crime does not pay. Giving information about how to commit crimes and all that sort of stuff. It was really a bit over the top. Really? I mean, you look at Superman. I know Superman does not exist. Well, he does exist, of course he does. No, Batman, all those sort of, they don't exist. They're stories, and that's all they are. It's like reading books about science fiction or Crimes and Punishment or Charles Dickens. Doesn't make you want to rush off and do various things. They're just books. And of course they said, oh, it was because kids were sort of not developed. They couldn't understand the reasons and all that sort of stuff. I think, well, obviously a lot of politics was involved as well in this, and it's a fascinating read. All obviously EC Comics quite central to this, but also one I just mentioned, Crime Does Not Pay, and also of course Kirby, Simon and Kirby, and many, many others. But it's just a fascinating study into also the period of the 50s. Actually, weirdly, there's hardly any mention of like music in terms of Elvis Presley and all sort of, because obviously that was also corrupting the kids. Sort of jazzed up hoodlums, etc. I don't think kids are really were. But however, of course, discusses a lot of things like all the comic burning, also that shops, that of course, and newsstands, they just did not want to put these on because, of course, they'd be fined. So there were like cities and states where they literally were putting down rules. You cannot have these comic books or else you get like $10,000 or something fine. And you think, wow. I mean, you don't have to ban things. You just literally make certain that people just don't distribute it. That's it. It's gone. And unfortunately, of course, now I must admit when I'm reading this, I'm always thinking, wonder why they just didn't bring out all of those comics in magazine form. You know, like they did with Mad. Mad came out, obviously it was a bigger format, and they could put it on the newsstand, and then it became, sort of reading matter. But I suppose they did with the sort of those picto fiction ones, which I have to say were not very good. But they're okay. But that was probably the reason they failed. It wasn't because if they brought out sort of weird science and weird fantasy and horns of horror and those sort of things in those big formats, I wonder if they would have succeeded better. But somehow the format they did bring out in the end with that just didn't work. But anyway, that's mighty cool. Obviously it happened. And so many, and it just reading this, it's so sad when you read the number of people that sort of artists that stopped. Writers, publishers, all this stuff was completely destroyed, thrown in the bin. Mentioned references all the way through, like Dick Ayers, where he turned around and gave some comics and he was like giving back to him saying, this stuff should be burned. Not sort of, wow, signed Dick Ayers, whatever his name. My apologies saying his name wrong. These books now are appreciated, but back then, just throw them in the bin. What? Don't give them to us. And it's terrible when you read this. All the kids that were sort of scared to have these things. I mean, I'm certain the kids probably wanted them. Obviously, some kids just went along with it, throw them. They were given good books, sort of, here's a cheap copy of Charles Dickens and say, go off and read. Hang on, and don't ever read some of Charles Dickens. Some of it's pretty rough. And yet they were going on about, there was all like Oliver Twist. Not exactly. It was a good book. Yeah, it's all about the street urchins of London and all the sort of the poor houses and whatever, orphanage. It wasn't exactly, but of course that was literature. Of course, comics were not literature. And it's just a fascinating book, reading all the way through this. I must admit, some of the EC comics go pretty extreme, but I'm certain at 10, I would have loved to have been reading those. I would have loved them, and I still enjoy reading them now. So, but it's But it's interesting, the politics, of course, communism, etc. And actually, sadly, there's not really much mentioning about TV. There's a little bit, but I would have thought TV, personally, would have been... but then again, trouble was all reduced to the very, very bland, sort of boring sort of things. I mean, it was just for the masses, which is fine, of course. Nothing wrong with that. But it's just such pity that other great stuff is just wiped off, destroyed. And, oh well. And I love the bits where, like, there's Bill Gaines, when, of course, he went to front of this committee and obviously clearly did not give... I wouldn't have given a very good defence either. I'm certain I would have been melting away and I would have been wiped out completely. So it's very hard, I guess, to defend sometimes some of these things. But it's got this bit here. I love this bit. Incredible Science Fiction was the last comic book EC would publish. This is 1956. It's quite amazing. Only about a couple of months later, of course, Showcase issue 4, which most people would think of as the Silver Age of comics, started at that point. But of course, Flash and those sort of things wasn't particularly... I guess even then, of course, they had the comic code. They had to go through this weird committee of group of people who were sort of like, as he often puts, old biddies and things, various church people, and no wonder they're going to look at it and see things in it, because you can look at anything and see things if you want to. You can read any book and say, oh, that's your interpretation. So very odd times, and I'm saying I'm glad it never really happened here, but again, in many ways it did, because of course we just didn't have the comics. That was as simple as that. Just never distributed here. Apparently we only had 3 issues of the EC comics, British versions that was. Now it's got a long list at the back. This is fascinating. Appendix at the back with all the artists. All the artists that just basically, well, their careers were not finished, because of course I'm certain they went off, and some went off to be like security guards and various things, but they were finished in terms of a comic book artist career. That's it. That was it. They finished, final page, and I'm able to see Henry Kuttner. Now, I don't know if that's the same Henry Kuttner, of course, successful science fiction writer. So obviously their careers weren't completely finished, but many obviously sadly were. And loads of publishers. I mean, some of my favourites, St John's. I loved St John's. Ace. All these sort of ones. Ones bringing out, obviously, Fawcett. All those sort of people brought out loads of great comics. Many, and I don't know which ones disappeared at this precise moment this time, but clearly the market dropped from selling millions of copies to next to nothing. Because, well, they had a code, and of course the kids looked at it and thought, oh, this is boring, compared with what had gone before. Of course, then they turned to something else. But obviously, of course, they're growing up, so they would have rock and roll and everything else. And so the world ever changes, I guess. But it's really sad. It's amazingly well described in this book. I mean, I've just found this fascinating going through all the various information about the money loss and all the various, just everything about it. Absolutely, I didn't realise, I must admit. So also, it's got a great selection of notes at the back. Lots of interviews by like George Tusker here, interviews with Joseph Birch, interview with Fujitani, etc. There's just pages upon pages of notes. So many of these things, sadly, I suspect, obviously these are interviews that they're not in magazines, so you can't really check out. But things like here, the Binghamton Sun in 1948. Burning books does not help, Pearson says. However, people did love burning books. Obviously, comics. But this is a fascinating list of references all the way back. And also at the back, you've got a really good bibliography. And I love bibliographies in books because it does mean that you can go off and find some more books. Like here, Superman, The Complete History. Brilliant book, that one. Well, I enjoyed it anyway. History of Comic Books in America. And so on and so on and so on. A Century of College Humour. Must admit, I didn't realise about the college, mentions a bit about college humour mags. Not much. But clearly there's a whole book available for writing about college humour books. Obviously, there it is. Century of College Humour. Maybe even still around. Random House, 1971. That one's a brilliant book as well. The Art of Nick Cardy. I love that one. Windsor Mackay. Brilliant. Oh, the new Smithsonian Book of Comic Book Stories. Not as good as the newspaper strip one, but still a pretty good book. Masters of Comic Book, and so on and so on. Obviously, a lot of these references are all books from the 1980s, 1970s, etc. and earlier. So, absolutely fascinating. Index at the back, and that's it. Just superb. This is definitely a book I will go back to and read again. It's just a fascinating insight into the world of the 1950s comic book, and so sad when you think all those companies that could have been around now. That's the thing that's really sad about it. Not maybe all of them, I suspect. Obviously, they would have some would have disappeared, but like this one, it rhymes with lust. Absolute Matt Baker, loved that work, brilliant. There's not many. There's a few pictures in here, but not many. So you've got obviously a picture of St Patrick's Academy in Binghamton in New York, 1949, and you've got burning the comics. Now, of course, when you look at these, you think, what comics are being burnt at this point? Can't really see. Actually, to be honest, they look more like newspapers. Menace, some kids reading a Menace comic. They were great comics, thoroughly enjoyable. I love it also here you've got kids getting free a sort of book back for the thing. Crime does not pay, I can see. Guilty. Stores tagged by the reading group and all this sort of thing. Of course, that sort of world is still there. There's always still people that will turn around and go into libraries and say, oh, look at this book. This is disgraceful. Or censor certain books. And anyway. Sadly, anyway, fascinating read. Totally brilliant. The 10 Cent Plague.